There's a phrase in business that everyone who's ever worked a deal understands. You need a closer. You can build the pitch deck, you can fly across the country, you can wine and dine the client for months. But if nobody can walk into the room and get the signature, none of it matters. China has spent the last decade building corridors, physical ones, highways blasted through the Karakoram Mountains, a deep-water port on the Arabian Sea, diplomatic ones, 26 phone calls from its top diplomat during a single crisis, a 5-point peace framework co-authored with Pakistan, a personal call from Xi Jinping to the Saudi Crown Prince, economic ones, $62 billion poured into a single country, all of it designed to extend Beijing's reach from Western China to the edge of the Persian Gulf. And last week, all of it led to a conference room in Islamabad where the other side didn't show up. Iran refused to attend the second round of US-Iran peace talks that Pakistan was hosting, talks that China had politically engineered behind the scenes, talks that Beijing helped make possible by pushing Iran toward the first ceasefire just 2 weeks earlier, the first direct engagement between American and Iranian officials in more than a decade. 26 phone calls, a co-authored framework, $62 billion in infrastructure, and Tehran didn't even send a junior delegation. The ceasefire is now expiring. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil normally flows, is still effectively closed. And that cost isn't some abstraction on a Bloomberg terminal. It's gas prices. It's grocery bills. It's the inflation number that's going to define midterm politics in this country. But the real story isn't the price of oil. The real story is what just happened to Chinese power. Because somewhere in Beijing, strategists are confronting a problem that no amount of infrastructure spending has been able to solve. China can build the corridor. It just doesn't have anyone who can close the deal at the end of it. And that weakness, quiet, structural, now fully visible, has implications that reach far beyond Islamabad. All the way, in fact, to Taiwan. Let me state the thesis of this video clearly. I want you to be able to test it against everything that follows. Iran's refusal to return to Pakistan isn't primarily about Iranian stubbornness, and it isn't primarily about Pakistan being embarrassed on the world stage. It's the most concrete evidence we've gotten this year of a structural limitation in how China projects power. Beijing has enormous economic weight. It purchases roughly 90% of Iran's exported oil. It holds a 25-year strategic cooperation agreement with Tehran, signed in 2021. It has invested more in Pakistan than in nearly any other country on the planet. And with all of that leverage, financial, diplomatic, institutional, it could not produce one outcome it needed. It could not get Iran to sit in a chair. The framework I want you to carry through this video is what I'm calling the corridor without a closer. China builds the road, it builds the port, it writes the talking points and signs the agreements. But when it needs someone, anyone, to walk into a room and deliver a result on its behalf under real pressure, it has no one. Not in South Asia, not in the Middle East. And the honest question that raises, one we'll get to, is whether it has anyone in the Western Pacific either. That's not a polemical claim, it's an analytical one. And the evidence for it just played out live over 2 weeks in Islamabad. To understand why this collapse matters, you need to understand how close things actually got, and how much machinery was built around the moment Iran walked away from. On April 11th, the United States and Iran held their highest-level direct talks since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The venue was Islamabad's Serena Hotel, a sprawling luxury property that Pakistani security services had essentially converted into a diplomatic fortress. 2 separate wings for the 2 delegations, a common area for trilateral sessions with Pakistani mediators. Every member of the hotel staff put through expedited background checks. Phones confiscated at the door. Vice President J.D. Vance led the American side. Iran sent its parliament speaker, Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf, and Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. Pakistan's army chief, General Asim Munir, and Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar moved between the 2 sides through the night, sometimes calming tensions, sometimes just buying time. According to Reuters, which sourced 11 people with direct knowledge of the session, the talks ran for over 20 hours. The atmosphere was heavy. At one point, raised voices could be heard through the walls of the negotiating chamber. Munir and Dar called a tea break to separate the sides before things deteriorated further. The core disputes were the ones you'd expect: Iran's nuclear enrichment program, the status of the Strait of Hormuz, the release of billions in frozen Iranian assets. Washington proposed a 20-year pause on enrichment. Tehran countered with 5. Trump has publicly said he wants 0, with no timeline attached. On Hormuz, Iran wants permanent control of the strait as a strategic asset. Washington wants that card removed from Iran's hand entirely. But here's what matters. Multiple sources describe the two sides as getting close, perhaps 80% of the way to a framework understanding, before the remaining gaps proved too wide to bridge on the spot. When Vance addressed reporters afterward, he called the American proposal a final and best offer and said the U.S. would see whether Iran accepted. A 2-week ceasefire was holding. A second round was scheduled. The architecture was in place. Then, between rounds, the United States changed the physics of the negotiation. On April 13th, Washington imposed a full naval blockade of Iranian ports. On April 19th, U.S. forces fired on and boarded the Iranian-flagged cargo ship Tuska in the Gulf of Oman. A second vessel, the MT Tiffany, was intercepted in the Asia-Pacific. Tehran called both seizures ceasefire violations. And inside Iran, the balance of power shifted. The Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, which holds more domestic authority than the Foreign Ministry, pushed the negotiating team to harden its stance. Their condition for returning to talks became absolute. End the blockade first, then we'll talk. On April 20th, Kalibaf posted on X that Trump was trying to turn the negotiating table into a table of surrender. Iran's state broadcaster confirmed that no delegation, primary, secondary, or otherwise, had traveled to Islamabad. Iran's judiciary chief said the country should maintain full readiness for renewed American strikes. So on the surface, this looks like a story about American coercion and Iranian pride, and partly it is. But there's another actor in this drama, one that barely appears in any of those headlines, and its absence from the story is itself the story. Here's where you have to shift your lens, because the actor that matters most in what just happened is the one no one is naming. China didn't observe this mediation from across the ocean. China helped construct it. On March 31st, Beijing and Islamabad jointly released a 5-point peace proposal for the Iran conflict. Ceasefire, resumption of Hormuz transit, civilian protection, maritime security, adherence to the UN Charter. This wasn't a vague statement of concern. It was a co-branded diplomatic framework, the first one China had put its name on for this war. Wang Yi, China's foreign minister, had by that point made 26 calls to counterparts across the Middle East and South Asia since the conflict began on February 28th. China's Middle East envoy, Jai Jun, held nearly 24 separate meetings. President Xi personally engaged Saudi and Emirati leadership in the days before and after the ceasefire. And according to the New York Times, it was China's political weight, not just Pakistan's shuttle diplomacy, that helped convince Iran to accept the ceasefire on April 8th. Beijing was not a bystander here. Beijing was a co-architect. So when Iran refused to return to a table that China helped design, in a country that China financially underwrites, during a crisis that directly threatens China's energy supply, that refusal didn't just embarrass Pakistan, it exposed Beijing. Now, I want to be precise here because precision matters when you're making a structural argument. I am not saying that Iran deliberately snubbed China. Tehran's stated reasons for pulling out were specific and, on their own terms, rational. The Tuska seizure changed the leverage dynamics overnight. The IRGC overruled the diplomatic team. The American blockade made returning to talks politically untenable for Iranian hardliners. Those reasons are real. They matter. But the analytical layer beneath them is where this gets important. China purchases approximately 90% of Iran's exported oil. It is Iran's largest trade partner by a wide margin. It signed a 25-year strategic cooperation agreement with Tehran. It spent 2 months mobilizing the most intensive diplomatic campaign it has undertaken in years, arguably since the Saudi-Iran normalization deal in 2023. And at the end of all of that, It could not convert a single dollar of economic leverage or a single hour of diplomatic effort into the one thing it needed: Iran sitting in a room. The country with the most financial leverage over Tehran had the least operational influence over Tehran's decision. Sit with that contradiction for a moment, because it's not a one-time anomaly, it's a pattern. And there's a second dimension that makes this worse. Before the talks collapsed, credible reporting, including from Vali Nasser, a former senior U.S. State Department official and one of the most respected Iran analysts in Washington, indicated that Tehran had asked for a guarantor, someone to underwrite any deal with the United States, a backstop, so that Washington couldn't simply walk away from its commitments the way it did with the JCPOA nuclear deal in 2018. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar flew to Beijing to raise this question directly with Chinese leadership. He made the trip despite a hairline shoulder fracture. That's how urgent Islamabad considered the request. By all available indications, Beijing declined. China would endorse frameworks. It would commend Pakistan's efforts. It would make phone calls. But it would not put its name on the line as the entity that enforces a deal between Washington and Tehran, because doing so would mean accepting a direct obligation, one that could put Beijing on a collision course with the United States. And that is a cost China is not prepared to pay. Not for Iran, not for Pakistan, and, this video will argue, not for anyone. That is the corridor without a closer in its purest form. The investment is enormous. The diplomatic vocabulary is polished. And the willingness to actually close, to accept risk, to take ownership of an outcome is absent. Now let's pull the camera back, because what happened in Islamabad is a data point in something much larger, something that I think will define great power competition for the rest of this decade. The 2026 Iran war is the first major armed conflict in a generation where the American alliance system and the Chinese partnership network are both under live pressure at the same time. Not in a policy paper, not in a think tank simulation, in an actual war, with real casualties, real ship seizures, real energy disruption, and real diplomatic stakes. And the two systems are producing very different results. Start with the American side. The coalition has held. Israel provided offensive strike capability. Gulf states, the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, provided early warning radar data, intercepted Iranian retaliatory missiles and drones, and continued hosting the bases that sustain American forward operations. Pakistan, despite its own complex position, hosted the most significant U.S.-Iran engagement in decades. 9 American aircraft landed in Pakistan in 3 days just to support the negotiating team's logistics. None of that happened because those countries love Washington. It happened because of deep institutional relationships, formal alliances, basing agreements, decades of interoperability, shared security architectures that create obligations and capacities which survive even when political leaders have disagreements. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth called it a force multiplier. That's military jargon. The civilian translation is simpler. America doesn't fight alone. And the system that makes that possible actually works under fire. Now look at the Chinese side. Pakistan, Beijing's closest South Asia partner, hosted talks but couldn't get the other party to attend. Iran, a comprehensive strategic partner with whom China has a 25-year agreement, walked away from a Chinese-backed framework without visible hesitation. Russia, a strategic partner that shares China's interest in multipolarity, has provided intelligence and some material support to Iran, but has not committed forces or absorbed meaningful risk. The Diplomat published a detailed analysis in March that captured this precisely. They called it China's alliance problem. And the core of the argument is straightforward. The United States fights coalition wars. It has partners who provide basing, logistics, intelligence, and in some cases, direct combat capability. China, by contrast, has one formal military ally, North Korea, and a series of strategic partnerships that are fundamentally different in kind from alliances. Here's the distinction that matters. Partnerships are built on mutual convenience. Alliances are built on mutual obligation. And convenience evaporates when the pressure becomes real. Beijing has historically preferred it this way. Chinese leaders absorbed a bitter lesson from the Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s. Formal alliances can become strategic straitjackets. They've built their entire international posture around flexible partnerships. They've called U.S. alliances Cold War relics that destabilize the global order. And maybe they were right about the theory. But the 2026 Iran war is testing the theory against reality, and the results are not favorable. Because here's the question no partnership agreement can answer. If China cannot get its most important regional partners to deliver a diplomatic outcome during a crisis that directly threatens Chinese energy security, what happens in a military crisis? What happens over Taiwan? Japan's prime minister has publicly stated that a Taiwan contingency could constitute a survival-threatening situation, justifying military response. The Philippines has said involvement would be inevitable. South Korea hosts 30,000 American troops. Australia is deepening integration through AUKUS. In that scenario, the United States would fight a coalition war, just as it's doing right now, in a different register, in the Middle East. Intelligence shared across allies, distributed basing that increases survivability, shared logistics that extend operational endurance. And China? Based on what we've seen, China would likely fight alone. Surrounded by a network of partners who express concern, issue statements, and then, when the cost becomes real, step back. I want to be clear. That is not a prediction. It's a question the evidence increasingly forces us to ask. And the Islamabad snub is the most recent, most vivid data point feeding it. There's a layer of this story that almost nobody is covering right now, and it might matter more than anything I've discussed so far, because it's not about diplomacy. It's about the physical infrastructure that was supposed to make all of this irrelevant. While the headlines tracked Iran's refusal to return to talks, something was happening in the background that tells you just how trapped China actually is. According to reporting from CNN News 18, citing sources familiar with a recent meeting between Pakistan's Army Chief Asim Munir and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, Beijing delivered a blunt ultimatum to Islamabad. No progress on current projects, no CPEC 2.0. The message centered on Gwadar Port, a deep-water facility on Pakistan's southwestern coast that has been the flagship of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor since its inception more than a decade ago. Now, Gwadar was never just a port. It was the answer to a strategic vulnerability Chinese planners have understood for years. The Malacca dilemma, the Hormuz dependency, the fundamental problem that too much of China's energy supply passes through choke points controlled either by the U.S. Navy or by unstable regional actors. CPEC was supposed to fix that. Oil and gas from the Gulf would arrive at Gwadar, move through pipelines and highways across Pakistan, and reach western China, without passing through a single contested strait. That was the plan. Here's the reality. Multiple Chinese construction projects in Gwadar have been halted since February 2026. The reason is instability along Pakistan's western border, the border with Iran, driven by the same war Beijing was trying to help resolve through the Islamabad talks. Security failures in Baluchistan, where Gwadar sits, have made it impossible to guarantee the safety of Chinese workers and assets. Beijing told Pakistan that without what it called foolproof security guarantees, further investment is off the table. Do you see the trap? China needs the Strait of Hormuz open because roughly 45 to 50% of its crude oil imports transit through it. That's according to researchers at Columbia University. Gwadar was supposed to reduce that dependency, but Gwadar is shutting down because of the Iran war. And the Iran war is the reason Hormuz is closed. China's backup plan is failing because of the same crisis that made the backup plan necessary. And it gets more tangled. Iran needs the Strait of Hormuz contested. It's Tehran's most powerful remaining leverage against the United States. China needs the strait open. Its economy depends on it. And yet, in April, when Bahrain sponsored a UN Security Council resolution to coordinate efforts to restore transit through Hormuz, China vetoed it. Beijing said the resolution failed to capture the root causes of the conflict. In other words, China voted to keep closed a waterway that its own economy desperately needs open. To protect a partner that just refused to follow a diplomatic roadmap China co-authored. That is not strategic ambiguity. That is strategic paralysis. Beijing is absorbing real economic damage to maintain solidarity with a partner it cannot influence, while the physical hedge it built to avoid this exact scenario rusts at the dock in Gwadar. The Chatham House analysis from February framed Beijing's approach generously. China is playing the long game, they said, positioning to increase Iran's dependency over time as Tehran weakens. And on a 5 or 10-year horizon, that may be true. But the long game assumes the short term doesn't collapse underneath you. And right now, with Hormuz closed, Gwadar frozen, the ceasefire expiring, and Iran ignoring Chinese preferences, the short term is not cooperating with the long game at all. If you're watching from the United States, I want to make 3 connections, and I want to make them specific enough that they actually matter. Not, this affects global stability. Everyone says that. Here's how it touches American life. The first is the most immediate. It's about money. The Strait of Hormuz normally handles roughly 20 million barrels of oil per day, close to 20% of global petroleum consumption. That flow has been disrupted for almost 2 months. First by Iran's actions after the war began on February 28th, then by the U.S. naval blockade imposed on April 13th. Combined, it's the most significant sustained energy supply shock since the 1973 Arab oil embargo. That is not a Middle East problem. It's an American kitchen table problem. Higher crude prices flow directly into gasoline, into transportation costs, into food prices, into the broader inflation picture. The Federal Reserve's ability to keep cutting rates, which affects your mortgage, your car loan, your small business lending environment, is constrained by energy-driven inflation. And all of this is hitting in the months before midterm elections, which means the political pressure on the White House to either resolve or escalate the Iran situation is intensifying by the week. When Iran refused to return to talks, when the diplomatic path that Pakistan and China had built collapsed, the probability of resumed war increased. Resumed war means sustained Hormuz disruption. Sustained Hormuz disruption means sustained pain at the pump. The failed diplomacy in Islamabad is not an abstract foreign policy story. It is a direct input into what you pay for gas next month. The second connection is strategic. It's about the military balance of power. Every contingency planner at the Pentagon, every analyst at Indo-Pacific Command is studying the 2026 Iran war as a real-world stress test. Coalitions versus non-coalitions. Allied warfare versus solo operations. And the results are validating the core assumption behind American defense strategy, that alliances are a decisive advantage. Gulf states absorbed Iranian missile and drone attacks without fracturing. Japan drew explicit public parallels to Taiwan. The Philippines signaled willingness to engage. These are not hypotheticals anymore. They are demonstrated behaviors under pressure. Now look at the other side. China's partnership network, the one it spent decades and hundreds of billions of dollars cultivating, could not deliver a diplomatic meeting. Not a military operation, not a naval escort, a meeting. If the corridor without a closer problem is this severe in a diplomatic context, the implications for a military one are profound. In a Taiwan scenario, the U.S. coalition would likely be distributed, resilient, and mutually reinforcing. China would be concentrated, isolated, and bearing the full operational burden alone. That asymmetry is arguably the single most important variable in whether a war over Taiwan gets deterred or attempted. And what just happened in Islamabad is one of the clearest recent demonstrations of it. If you care about whether the next decade is stable or dangerous, this should matter to you. The third connection is about diplomatic infrastructure, and it's the one most people overlook. Pakistan is the only country in the world with military and security ties to both Washington and Tehran. It's the only venue both sides agreed to use for face-to-face talks. That mediating role is rare, and it is fragile. If Iran's refusal damages Pakistan's credibility as an honest broker, or if Washington simply concludes that Islamabad can't deliver Tehran, the United States loses one of its very few indirect channels to Iranian leadership. That doesn't just make this crisis harder to resolve, it makes the next one harder to prevent. The alternatives exist: Turkey, Oman, Swiss-facilitated back channels. But none carry the same combination of military access, geographic proximity, and relationships on both sides that Pakistan offered. If that channel degrades, the diplomatic distance between the United States and Iran gets longer, at exactly the moment it needs to be getting shorter. I want to leave you with 5 specific things to watch in the coming weeks. Not vague trends. Specific, observable signals that will tell you whether the pattern I've described is deepening or beginning to shift. First, the ceasefire itself. Trump extended the deadline by 24 hours and publicly called a further extension highly unlikely. If Iran sends any delegation, even a reduced one, even an informal back-channel team, it means the diplomatic architecture survived. If the ceasefire expires without contact and fighting resumes, every dynamic in this video accelerates. Hormuz stays closed, oil stays elevated, Gwadar stays frozen, and China's partnership failure becomes harder to explain away. Second, watch for any sign that Beijing is trying to reach the IRGC directly. This is the critical distinction. All of China's diplomatic engagement on this crisis has been at the foreign ministry level. Wang Yi calling Arakchi, envoys meeting counterparts. But the IRGC is the power center that overruled Iran's diplomatic team and drove the decision to stay home. If there's any indication, a visit, a back-channel signal, a change in the quality of Chinese pressure, that Beijing is engaging the Revolutionary Guard rather than just the foreign ministry, that would represent a genuine escalation of Chinese involvement. It probably won't be public. Watch for it in leaks and sourcing. Third, Gwadar. This one is easy to track and almost nobody is watching it closely enough. If Chinese construction projects resume in the coming weeks, it means Beijing still believes the CPEC bet can pay off. If the freeze persists, or if additional projects get suspended, that's Beijing quietly downgrading the value of its most expensive foreign investment. And that signal carries implications well beyond Pakistan. It tells you how Beijing is reassessing risk across the entire Belt and Road. Fourth, the Trump-Xi summit. It's currently expected around mid-May. Pay attention not just to whether Iran comes up, but how. If it appears in the joint readout, even in coded language about regional stability or maritime security, it means the two leaders discussed it substantively. If it's absent from the communiqué, that's a signal too. It likely means Beijing is still refusing to engage Washington directly on this conflict and will keep operating through proxies and frameworks. Don't ignore what's missing from a summit statement. The absence of a topic is itself a tell. Fifth, and this is the one with the longest tail, where the next round of diplomacy gets hosted. If the United States keeps routing Iran diplomacy through Pakistan, if Vance or Witkoff or Kushner return to Islamabad, it means Washington still sees value in that channel, and by extension, in the China-Pakistan diplomatic pairing. But if the next meeting happens in Ankara, or Muscat, or through a direct Swiss-facilitated back channel, that means the U.S. has concluded that the Islamabad pathway is spent. And when the U.S. walks away from Pakistan's mediator role, China loses one of its last remaining ways to shape the outcome of a conflict that threatens its most vital interests. Here's where all of this converges. China spent a decade building a corridor through South Asia, $62 billion, highways through mountains, a deep-water port on the Arabian Sea, a 25-year agreement with Tehran, a co-authored peace framework, 26 phone calls from its top diplomat, a personal intervention from Xi Jinping himself. And at the end of it, the country that was supposed to sit across the table in Islamabad, the country China buys 90% of its oil from, didn't come. There is a version of this story where that's just a bad week, where it's just Iran being Iran, where the IRGC was always going to overrule the diplomats, and the American blockade was always going to change the calculus. But I don't think that's the right read. I think what happened in Islamabad is a visible crack in something deeper. China's model of influence, invest heavily, build infrastructure, sign agreements, make phone calls, and trust that economic gravity will pull partners into alignment. That model has a ceiling. And the ceiling becomes visible exactly when the stakes are highest, when the ships are being seized, when the Strait is closed, when the war might restart, when you actually need someone to close. The corridor without a closer isn't a metaphor anymore. It just played out, in real time, at the Serena Hotel. And the question it leaves behind is the one that should keep strategists in Beijing awake at night and quietly reassure planners in Washington. If China can't close in South Asia, using its most important partner during a war that threatens its energy lifeline, on a framework it helped write, where exactly can it close? The ceasefire is expiring as you watch this. The Trump-Xi summit is weeks away. The Gwadar freeze is an ongoing, trackable signal that will tell you whether Beijing is adjusting course or doubling down on a strategy that just failed publicly. This story has a next chapter, and it's coming fast. If this video showed you a dimension of the Iran crisis you hadn't seen before, if the corridor without a closer gave you a framework that changes how you read what's coming next, subscribe. This channel exists to find the structural signal under the headline, and the next move in this story is already forming. One more thing before you go. I want to hear from you on something specific. China's defenders would make a reasonable argument here. They'd say the partnership model is designed to be flexible, that the whole point is to avoid the entanglements and obligations that come with formal alliances, that what I'm calling a weakness is actually a feature. So here's my question. Does what just happened in Islamabad prove that argument, or does it destroy it? I've laid out my case, now make yours. Comments are open.